I don't want to get too far into the weeds of how much of this is culture, how much of it is economics. I think there's both issues are happening there, but I think it is very clear that the economic systems that we have set up, particularly in the United States, though not only in the United States, are not set up to reward or encourage the values that we claim to care about, whether it is strong families or a strong country, a virtuous patriotic citizenship, et cetera, et cetera. Those things are very difficult to maintain and have become essentially luxury goods under the economic paradigms that we have in place today.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Johnny Burtka and Marlo Slayback. Joining us on the podcast today is Julius Krein, who is the founder and editor-in-chief of American Affairs magazine, a graduate of Harvard University, and then went to work in finance before leaving to start American Affairs, which is a quarterly journal of public policy and political thought. It was founded to provide a forum for people who believe that the conventional partisan platforms are no longer relevant to the most pressing challenges facing the country. He currently serves American Affairs as the editor-in-chief. It's good to have you with us, Julius.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Before we begin our interview, I'd like to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. The mission of ISI is to educate for liberty. If you'd like to join us in fulfilling this mission, be sure to rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts to help us reach more listeners like yourself.
Great. Well, Julius, I wanted to start with that Wall Street Journal poll that you probably saw last week that was demonstrating this disconcerting phenomena, basically a collapse in the civilizational values that we have here in America. And what I thought was particularly interesting about the poll is that it was taken over the course of the past 20 years, which is basically the lifetime of an ISI student. Our average student is probably a sophomore, junior in college. And over the course of this period, we saw in a number of areas significant, even kind of cataclysmic drops in different areas. Patriotism was down from 70% to 38%, religion from 62 to 39, having children 59 to 30, community involvement 62 to 27. And the only thing that actually went up in terms of importance was money. People who cared about money went up from 31% to 43%. I know there's, a lot of hand-wringing on the right, I think rightfully so, about these declines. But I'm curious what you make of these trends. Is it, primarily due to the economic shocks we saw with the financial crisis and COVID and inflation, or is there something else going on? And also, where have you seen perhaps some of the best solutions being offered to these ills?
Okay, well, that's a big question. First of all, I would say I wasn't really surprised by the numbers. And I think, if you spend any time talking to people, I don't think they need to be under 25, but probably under 45, 50. You'll have heard premonitions of this. I really don't think it's terribly surprising. One thing I'll just say, we have an article coming up, and it's not finished yet, and all the numbers are not completed, so I don't want to make too strong of a claim. But there's an interesting study out there basically showing that across the entire advanced economy world, there's not a single place where the median household is both a net contributor to the federal budget in their country, as well as has a fertility rate at or above replacement. So basically, you are either on welfare or you don't have any children, and that's across the whole developed world. So I don't want to get too far into the weeds of how much of this is culture, how much of it is economics. I think there's both issues are happening there, but I think it is very clear that the economic systems that we have set up, particularly in the United States, though not only in the United States, are not set up to reward or encourage the values that we claim to care about, whether it is strong families or a strong country, a virtuous patriotic citizenship, et cetera, et cetera. those things are very difficult to maintain and have become essentially luxury goods under the economic paradigms that we have in place today. As for solutions, we can go deep into these weeds, I'm sure, as we go along here. But I think certainly the economic ones are a little bit easier, just because it's a lot easier to change economic policy than it is to change social mores and things like that. But certainly I would begin with reorienting our economy away from a lot of the kind of very unequal, what you might call intellectual property rents or asset value orientation, asset accumulation, and toward sort of productive industries that reward a more distributed investment, or a stronger connection, I would say, between firm profits and asset values, and actually investment into production, productivity growth, and local national communities inside the country. That's not going to solve every problem, but I think it would at least create conditions that would make it easier for families and communities to thrive.
One real quick follow-up to that, maybe it's not particularly quick, but I think it would help to frame this conversation. I'm wondering if you could kind of provide a historical perspective on the different structures of the American economy that we've had in the last 200 years, and maybe in broad strokes, what were the changes that took place, and when did the finance sort of dominated economy that we have now come into being?
Yeah, well, I just wrote a piece for the American Conservative. It was actually a book review, but I sort of went through a very quick, I'm sure vastly oversimplified history of some of this stuff. But I think in the early republic, you really have kind of a divide between what you might call the sort of commercially dynamic, industrializing North versus, of course, a more rentier, quasi-feudal South. This is resolved by the Civil War, and then you move into the so-called Gilded Age, where on the one hand you have the growth of really large modern corporations at the level of, say, taxation, regulation. It's very laissez-faire, but on the level of certain things like industrial promotion, tariffs, railroad construction, subsidized railroad construction, things like that, you have actually a very activist federal government. This paradigm, I would say, kind of breaks down, obviously, with the Great Depression, though the seeds are sown before that. But basically, at this point, you have new issues arising where the kind of continued economic growth requires actually more macroeconomic stability. And that's out of that, you get kind of the New Deal corporatist era, where you have, of course, much more regulation, more taxation, more formalized relationships between industry and government, stronger unions, things like that. Though, interestingly, it's at this time, if for no other reason, that the U.S., dominates global industry after World War II. You see a lot of the tariffs and stuff like that coming down. Some of the more conventional forms of industrial strategy beginning to fade away as time goes on. And that model kind of breaks down, in the 60s, 70s. The causes, I don't think I'm saying anything new here, but you have inflation coming around from both the Great Society and Vietnam War. U.S. oil production peaks, at least for that time, and the U.S. becomes much more reliant on foreign fuel imports, which they themselves are becoming nationalized in the Middle East and elsewhere. Oil, the energy crisis, and we've had kind of rising oil prices in the last few months, but it's just when you compare it, in the 1970s, oil prices rose like 5 times. Like, they didn't just double; it was like 5 times. So the magnitude of that shock was very significant. And the U.S. economy itself, the industrial economy, is becoming much less competitive. There's a lot of things happening there, but in general, places like Japan, Germany, They've been running their own industrial strategies. They have very asymmetric tariffs. They're really catching up, and the U.S. is becoming less competitive on that score. And all these things sort of lead to the shift, what's called the neoliberal turn, or something like that, where on the one hand you have massive tax cuts. You have a shift away. We sort of give up on kind of tariffs and trade to protect our own industries, and actually instead shift toward intellectual property. We're going to have an economy. That's the roots of the kind of designed in California, made in China, where we're going to profit off the intellectual property rights, and all the manufacturing is going to be done in subsidized or low wage countries elsewhere. And it's around this time, of course, that financialization really takes off, both as a conscious strategy. There were a number of reforms to strengthen the power of shareholders in corporate governance, to strengthen, at the time, it would be sort of non-traditional or alternative forms of managing capital and lending. And then, of course, just unintentionally, as you have other sectors of the economy in decline, finance becomes much more significant. And that brings us to, sort of the great financial crisis, if you will, and everything since then. And I think with the Trump administration, we might look at that as kind of the biggest indication of a turning point where America begins moving away from those sorts of neoliberal paradigms and starting to rebuild some of our domestic industries and things like that. Though none of that, I think, is quite hardened into a new paradigm yet. We're still sort of sorting things out and figuring it out, and the shift is kind of underway. So in 3 minutes or so, I think I covered about 200 years.
So on the note of neoliberal consensus, there were always some undercurrents of opposition to that, I think. And from the sense of what I've gotten from a lot of our other speakers at some of our other ISI events, including we had Robert Lighthizer give one of the keynote speeches at the American Economic Forum last year. But why were they disregarded or shunned politically? And why do you think they're now, in some sense, in the driver's seat? The people that formerly were kind of the drivers of, there's so many different terms for it, but among them, free trade consensus, neoliberal consensus, what you were just talking about earlier.
Yeah. Where to begin? I think, there's it's not so much a new book now, but a relatively recent book by Gary Gersel called The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order. And he discusses in this history than I've seen in a lot of other places, a very succinct kind of summary of how U.S. corporate strategies, even well before the neoliberal turn, began adapting to situations where, say, Japan and Germany had very high tariffs, and to get around that, they would begin doing offshoring production to those places, doing local partnerships, whatever. So in some ways, the corporate behavior was already fully prepared when the neoliberal turn actually happened. And then once it started, I think it was just immensely profitable, and it seemed to be working. And I think it's fair to say, in the early period, it basically was working, where, moving all your manufacturing and separating the costs of production from the intellectual property rents is just a phenomenally profitable strategy and leads to great financial gains, at least at the stock market level. You also didn't have, you were starting from a relatively high base, so it took a while for all the problems to become apparent. But essentially, it was sort of a lot of short-term benefit, laying the seeds for the long-term pain, and that hadn't been fully realized yet. Whether that was the loss of key industries for national security perspective, whether it was the hollowing out of the U.S. industrial economy, various regions, local economies, loss of workforce skills, loss of stable employment, rise of deaths of despair. These issues just hadn't manifested. And, when you're making a lot of money on it, people have a lot of reason to believe that they never will, and it's all just fantastic. And the previous consensus, or you might call the New Deal consensus or whatever, was really a drift by the 70s. I think a lot of the productive impulses of the New Deal had been lost. It had been kind of degenerated into a sort of welfarism, much of which wasn't particularly well designed. They really had no response to the kind of stagflation of the 70s. And so it created that opening, and it was very profitable. And, for 20 years or so, people didn't really recognize the problems. And then there was also just so much enthusiasm around the end of history, end of the Cold War. And it may have been somewhat, instrumental and cynical for people to sit around and say, oh, China's going to become democracy because we're trading with them and it'll all be great and everyone's going to be just like us. And we'll never lose any of our advantages in high-tech industries and things like that. That was obviously cynical at some level, but I think a lot of people genuinely believe that. It's a rather silly thing to believe. I don't think history's ever worked that way. But everybody thought the world was going to be different because the Cold War was over and it was the end of history. So I think all those factors combined just created a very strong consensus that the neoliberal model was the way to go. And it's only, really since 2000 and China joined the WTO where you start to see massive deterioration in a host of areas and eventually just can't be ignored anymore. And you also just, since the financial crisis, since the 2000s, the neoliberal model just hasn't delivered on its own terms: growth, productivity, widespread prosperity, things like that.
Julius, you had mentioned that during the Gilded Age, it was this mixture of, there were low taxes, low regulation, but there was also some form of industrial strategy in the form of tariffs or infrastructure development. Kind of fast forwarding to the Cold War era, the Reagan era, someone could look back on that period and say, oh, that was just, an era of free markets and free trade. But David Goldman, who's spoken at ISI conferences, makes the case that while there was an emphasis on cutting taxes, there was also investments made in kind of strategically competing with the USSR in certain critical industries. I'm wondering if you could maybe comment on what military industrial policy looked like during the Cold War era and specifically during the Reagan administration.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it was when one of our first issues, which is now seven long years ago, David Goldman wrote a piece called, I believe it was something like "The Digital Age Produces Binary Outcomes," which I think is still one of the most important pieces we publish. And he goes through a lot of this history about the investments that were made, actually beginning with Carter and through Reagan into basic research and development, into high technology areas, most of which was under the leadership of the military and the DoD, and the significance of those programs, both in winning the Cold War and kind of setting the stage for the economic boom of the 80s through 2000 or whatever. And I think it is underappreciated how much of our sort of internet economy and all the things that have become the hallmarks of this neoliberal economy were really built around a lot of both DoD funding and research, which, in the early days was most of the money in Silicon Valley, actually. And there were a number of other kind of government programs. The 1958 Small Business Act created a bunch of stuff that was very interesting. As well as the other piece here is corporate labs. Bell, go to the Wikipedia page for Bell Labs, and they have more patents and more Nobel Prizes than anybody. But there were lots of others: RCA Labs, Xerox PARC, which, if you're into Silicon Valley lore, figures prominently in that one. So those things were definitely there doing some of the advanced research that would eventually become commercialized. And there's another book that's very good called America Inc. I forget the subtitle, but it goes through this. And I think the Cold War really was a moderating or kind of disciplinary force on some of the, kind of keeping the market enthusiasms in check a little bit and preventing it from drifting off just into total theory and I guess what we would now call market fundamentalism, because fundamentally people realized that they had to compete with the Soviet Union, which was a very real threat. And it's interesting kind of the extent to which the discussion in a lot of cases, it wasn't so much like we're just going to untether the market and then do whatever happens and it's going to be great. It was a sort of we need to sort of channel and influence capital to flow into the directions we need it to go, to produce this kind of industry and economy that could defeat the Soviet Union. So some of the early neoliberal reforms actually, tracing their trajectory, even things like high yield debt, which became a big deal in the 80s, junk bonds, all that stuff. There were, some of that was private sector innovation. There were also policy changes to make it easier to invest in that stuff for pensions and so on. But in those early days, that did shift capital away from kind of big stagnant businesses to new growing businesses. And then it's, over time, it ends up just kind of becoming a financialization machine with people buying subprime mortgages and just recycling capital into unproductive or even destabilizing kind of financial engineering games. But in the initial period with the Cold War, I think there was very much an awareness that sort of we need to channel capital into these key industries and technologies, whether through DoD funding, whether through making it easier for private sector to invest in these. And with the end of the Cold War, I think a lot of that thinking, a lot of those impulses sort of disappeared, and the programs that might have worked then and channeled capital very productively then end up kind of going off the rails. And again, you get subprime mortgages and all these, asset bubbles and crypto Ponzi schemes and stuff like that.
Speaking a little bit more theoretically, especially wanted to follow up about some of the social pathologies that we're seeing from, lowered birth rate to deaths of despair that you mentioned earlier. One of the key premises of capitalism is that it's mutually advantageous or positive sum, and also that free markets create continuous growth from profits. And from a global perspective, that seems to be true. Poverty has been reduced, and so there are these very positive developments, I'm sure. But from an American perspective, you mentioned earlier deaths of despair. I'm from Western Pennsylvania, so that's kind of an unfortunate reality that people from this part of the country have to deal with, especially in West Virginia and the rest of this Allegheny, Appalachia area. So in your view, are the phenomena we are seeing departures from capitalism, or do you think they're failures of capitalism? And do you think that we need to find adjustments and different ways of thinking about these issues outside of, just the framework of what we understand to be capitalism?
Yeah, well, first, I'm not sure I fully agree with the global statement. Most of the poverty reduction has occurred in China, and in part, of course, that is a result of China's opening up to an integration into global markets. But it's also a result of very intentional, in some cases, heavy-handed government industrial policies and other policies designed to build a manufacturing powerhouse. And in a lot of the places outside of China, much of that was simply a sort of commodity boom driven by the rise of China. And there's an article we published 1 or 2 issues ago by David Ox and Henry Williams called "The Long, Slow Death of Global Development," which again I think is among the most important things we've published over the last few years, that sort of looks at this. And actually, what you find is in a lot of places, the conditions for global development, moving up the income ladder, in a lot of these places are much worse now than they were in the 70s or 80s. And so I'm not sure. And actually, where you do see countries doing that, it's because they had very clear industrial policies and and also the political will and ability to execute them reasonably well. The Asian tigers, things like that. Today, Vietnam is probably the most kind of inspiring success story, if you will. And it has, a very interesting approach to industrial policy. So I'm not sure that I agree that, capitalism as an ism simply lifts people out of poverty by itself. Though certainly, some element of market principles and competition is necessary everywhere, and every successful industrial policy kind of takes that into account in some way or another. But I also want to I think we do ourselves a disservice when we talk about sort of capitalism as an ism and interpret it in this kind of very rigid textbook economics sort of way. What you have, or, how I would define capitalism simply is sort of private wealth accumulation. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's laissez-faire. That's why you have, state capitalism is a thing. It's not an oxymoron. And so it's really a question of, are you successful in kind of channeling the forces, the incentives of the private sector in ways that are very, very beneficial for the common good, if you will, or are you creating a sort of rentier economy where kind of the large capital holders are sort of have a more parasitic relationship with the rest of society and are actually impeding development, because you can become very wealthy by impeding technological and other development, as you see, in places like Nigeria and things like that, where there's literally a thing called the diesel importers cartel, which has prevented the development of domestic refining and other capacity because they make a lot of money importing, and actually even power grid, because they make a lot of money importing diesel. If you have electricity in Nigeria today, you're not getting it from normal grid power. For most people, there's something like 8 gigawatts of total power generation in all of Nigeria. You actually have your own little home generator and you're importing diesel fuel for it, and it costs like $12,000 a year or something. And there's a lot of people making a lot of money on that. So I think rather than think of, capitalism as some kind of Adam Smith textbook thing, we really need to think about, harnessing the forces of this and the right approach to sort of maximize development of the whole rather than simply laissez-faire.
Julius, a lot of thought leaders have been sort of asking the question: how do we, in our contemporary context, resolve this age-old philosophical tension between the few and the many? And Patrick Deneen has a new book called Regime Change, and he's really looking at, how do you create a mixed regime where essentially elite interests are aligned with the common good or with the interests of, ordinary working people. And I'm curious, from an economic perspective, let's say going back to Henry Ford, there's sort of the idea, I guess it was, in reference to GM, what's good for GM is good for America. Henry Ford was, not that there wasn't, a certain degree of perhaps exploitation of workers and, unions rising up to kind of, increase worker power. But, there was a sense in which what was good for the big time Gilded Age capitalist was also good for their workers. They could afford to buy, a Ford car made on the assembly line as well. And so I'm wondering, in our context today, is there a way to actually realign in our financialized economy elite financial interests with that of ordinary people? And maybe even more practically, Philip Blond, who's a friend of ISI's, talked a lot about sort of recapitalizing the poor. And he has some policy ideas for how you might do that within the context of our current financial system. So I'm wondering your thoughts on realigning elite financial incentives.
Yeah. So I actually think from the policy side, it's kind of easy, and I can give you policy proposals all day, or maybe easy is the wrong word, but it's intellectually straightforward. the question is the sort of execution, and is there a kind of coalition, particularly of elites, that would want to pursue this? And here I tend to have a more pessimistic set of intellectual influences, maybe people like James Burnham and things like that, where it's less about relying on some sort of, extremely virtuous, well-intentioned elite, though that would be nice. It would be, we shouldn't pretend that they're all perfectly virtuous. It'd be nice not to have to pretend that they're all, evil or whatever too. But I think it ends up being less about, somebody read Aristotle and decided to do the right thing. And it ends up, as Burnham would say, kind of more a matter of elite competition and how it plays out. And when elites are sort of competing with each other, that's when they have a greater incentive to, you might say, recruit the people as allies or ensure that the people are benefiting from whatever regime they're trying to install and benefit from their own rule. And I think, Michael Lind has written about this, but that can come about through foreign competition. Certainly U.S. elites in the Cold War, communism was a real threat in Europe and for a while, maybe even in the United States at some level. And they wanted to show that, their system would lead to a better standard of living, better outcomes, healthier society for the common man than communism would. So you saw things like the Nixon Khrushchev kitchen debate, stuff like that. And it could also come, I think, internally. I mean, now with the kind of rise of China and the increasing rivalry there, maybe some of that is happening. But also, to some level, I think it happens internally where, in these paradigms, you end up having a sort of very stable elite that forms at the top and is very invested in the status quo. That was true in the Gilded Age. It was true in the New Deal economy. It's true in the neoliberal economy. And then you have all these kind of rising forces that even if all they want is kind of their own power and wealth, they know that to reach the heights, they need to disrupt the status quo because, all the seats are sort of taken. All of the, the search engine's already built. The dating apps are already built. Like, you're not really going to make all that much money doing that again. And these people, I think, whatever their virtues, have a greater interest and a sort of investment in building a new paradigm. And I think that's why, you see these elite, one of the reasons you see elite configurations and coalitions shifting. And I think we're kind of working through that now.
So I do want to shift gears a little bit to talk about American affairs, which we mentioned in your intro and that you've discussed a little bit in your responses. And if you could give kind of a little bit of a background for people who are unfamiliar with American affairs, but also talk about how it seems to be geared towards an audience that realizes that the conventional political platforms are quite outmoded. So American affairs can kind of be called a child of the realignment. So perhaps, how have you been kind of tracking the realignment? I know we've kind of talked about a several 100-year history here, but in more recent years, which I think a lot of our students will be able to track a little bit better since they were either in high school or college or years where they're a little bit more familiar with tracking these trends, especially economically. Where do you think American affairs' role has been throughout all of this? And do you think that the realignment will continue to take shape on the right, especially in the next few years with subsequent elections?
That mission statement was written when we launched 7 years ago. I don't know if maybe we should update that as conditions change. I don't know how that works. But certainly when we started, we were really kind of one of the first organizations really formed around this and the new trends, new ideas that were bubbling up. And so when we started, we were sort of a one-stop shop for everything. We had to cover kind of the theory and the technical and analysis and the economic analysis and the social analysis. One of the interesting things to watch over the years has been the rise of new organizations around similar themes. So we have, American Compass, which is a think tank. We have Compact Magazine that recently launched. There's American Moment and a number of other, I would say the American Conservative, was founded, mainly out of the kind of battles of the Iraq War and neoconservatism. And now I think looks at a lot, and also, Pat Buchanan had a lot of interesting views on trade, which proved correct and things like that. But, now is maybe kind of doing a lot of similar work as well. So in some ways, for us, it's been kind of what can we do that's, there's more of a, Smithian division of labor now, if you will. And, it's kind of what can we do that is, unique and remains important and relevant. And I think on the one hand, we've maintained kind of from the beginning, we were sort of left-right populist, like we were always kind of nonpartisan or tried to transcend those divides. As things have moved, it's kind of been interesting as the centers maybe of both parties are moving at different speeds towards some of these goals. We're kind of less about that and more about sort of figuring out how to turn these things from outside ideas into, inside consensus. The other thing is I've noticed there's a real, I think, a gap, a vacuum on the right, at least relative to the left, in terms of doing the kind of very, very technical policy analysis that goes into, it's one thing to have an idea. And then you have to do a study, and then you have to actually figure out how would you sort of implement this in practice, and what coalition are you going to build, whether an industry coalition or various state governments, whatever, all the different kinds of stakeholders that go into getting anything done. And I don't think the right has done this very well. I think we have a lot of political theorists, and we maybe have a few people that can do. Or we have people that do economic studies, but unfortunately, for the most part, they've only done them in order to prove that the government always fails. We tend not to have a lot of expertise in sort of designing positive programs. And it actually kind of struck me recently. I was at the MIT Museum, and they had all this stuff about like CRISPR and AI and all the sort of new technologies. And intermixed with all of it was this very heavy-handed kind of left woke language and values kind of mixed into that. And it struck me that the right actually often doesn't think about these things in a sort of holistic way that brings a lot of this stuff together. And James Burnham wrote, kind of why paradigms change is because sort of new resources, new abilities come on the scene, whether through technology or whatever. And the governance paradigms that know how to use those forces will win out, and those that don't lose. And I feel like we on the right, it tends to complain a lot and have a lot of political theory, but there's not a lot of thinking about how do we actually use technological resources, human resources, whatever, to take these, wealth, resources, abilities, technologies to build the kinds of societies we want. How do you take advantage of emerging technology and financial capital to build an economy that's, conducive to strong families and traditional value systems in communities? There's just not a lot of thought about that, in my opinion. And so, to the extent I think we can be valuable, it's maybe hopefully trying to bring those issues together, both in the practical policy sense and uniting sort of government action and social action with kind of hopefully a vision of a healthier society.
Julius, picking up on your critique on the fact that the right is overly dominated by theorists, whether it's political theorists or even on the economic side, sort of going back to 18th century Britain or America, kind of trying to understand things in a very simple sense of how markets work, and then sort of hoisting that framework onto, deducing universal sort of principles and then hoisting that framework onto today. I'm wondering, perhaps part of the reason is I do think when we think about the economy as it's structured today, some of the technical jargon that's used to describe what's going on, it's a little bit challenging for someone, especially many of our students who come from a liberal arts background, to really wrap their minds around it. I'm thinking of terminology like high yield markets, leveraging, fractional reserve banking, PE ratio, share buybacks, derivative markets, securities, right, et cetera, et cetera. Do you have any recommendations for students coming from a liberal arts background in terms of like a primer so that they can really understand what the heck is going on in terms of how our contemporary markets are structured? Perhaps, if we can maybe reduce make it a little more intelligible, there'd be less of a reflexive turn to abstract theory when dealing with some of these issues.
In one sentence, I would say, kind of go get a job, which, should be advice very welcome on the right. But no, and for multiple reasons. One, like, if you actually learn an industry, that will give you an entry point into all this stuff. And two, what I found, most of like finance, and everybody knows that the jargon is there to serve as an intimidating layer for other people, so that they pay you more because they think that they don't know what you're doing. But most of this stuff, you have to learn the vocabulary, but the concepts are not that difficult. And I think every industry has its own jargon and its own little walls it creates around itself to extract rent, essentially. And once you learn how that works, you'll see that academic economics is no different, except maybe a little bit worse and a little bit more destructive. But no, I think don't be intimidated by it. Learn the vocabulary, and I think what we're missing in many ways is not so much someone who can go do another silly random controlled trial in economics and pretend that they made a big contribution, but people that know engineering, know robotics, know how to run a factory. These are the skills that I think will actually, if there is to be a paradigm shift in the way that I think we need, those are the skills that are going to be very valuable, both in actual regular life as well as coming up with policy and theory. So yeah, that's my best advice.
Well, thanks so much, Julius, for joining us today. Or Julian, sorry, Julius. And if people want to follow you and your work, where can they find you in addition to American Affairs?
So the publication's at AmericanAffairsJournal.org. And if, I don't really tweet, but I sort of use Twitter to kind of put up a list of whatever writings I've done or published recently. If you want to follow my work at other publications, you can just, look for me at twitter.com. And good luck with that.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please head over to isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, Select Modern Age articles, ISI books, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.